How much state aid do schools receive per student? Do charter schools receive the same amount? How is state aid funding impacting both charter and public schools? Before you answer these questions, let me tell you a story. Three co-workers, Quincy, John, and Rex, realized they each intended to dine at the same restaurant the same night. They had a great idea: share a table, talk shop, and call it a business dinner. All three ordered the same $80 steak dinner. $240 later, the evening was complete. The next day, each of the three received $80 reimbursement checks from their company. However, one issue remained. Quincy had chosen the restaurant because he possessed a 50% off coupon. So while he was reimbursed $80 for the meal, he only spent $40. As a result, he contributed the $40 difference to what was called the Even Steven pot. John had a $20 off coupon. As he received a full $80 check for what was a $60 meal, John added the $20 gain to the Even Steven pot. The night of the dinner was actually Rex's birthday, and everyone knows birthday boys eat free. Although he had come out $80 ahead, Rex chose to hang on to his birthday rights by contributing $0 to the Even Steven pot. At that point, the $60 Even Steven pot was split evenly, $20 to each person. Let's move our story to a chart, starting with all distributions. Quincy, John, and Rex each received an $80 check from the company. They also received $20 from the Even Steven pot, bringing total distributions to $100 each. Quincy contributed $40 to the Even Steven pot, resulting in a net night of $60. John added $20 to the pot, leaving him with $80. And Rex, who added nothing, ended up with $100 from the dinner. This story is a true representation of how state aid funding to schools works. The commonly referred to state funding factor, seen as the total funding factor in our chart, is represented by the $100 distribution in our story. This total funding factor is not a true measure of state aid. Instead, it is comprised of both the true funding factor, the $80 check, and the $20 redistribution of the Even Steven pot, called the equalization funding factor. This $20 does not represent state aid, only the shift of money between friends. However, the state aid allocation form presents only the total funding factor. This unintentional lack of transparency creates problems. The total funding factor is often misused in attempts to measure changes in the financial support of schools. Many argue that as long as we stick to the same measurement point of total funding factor, we are comparing apples to apples. Let's test that theory. As fiscal year 12 lends itself well to this test, we will compare it to fiscal year 16. The total funding factor, or the $100 from our story, was $3,040.20 in fiscal year 12 and $3,034.60 in fiscal year 16. This leads many to pronounce a $5.60 per student decrease in funding. However, if we look at the true funding factor, the $80 check from our story, we see that schools received $1,699.43 per student in fiscal year 12, while receiving $1,601.40 per child in fiscal year 16, a decrease of over $98 per student. As you can see, comparing total funding factors from year to year is actually an apples to oranges comparison. Now that we have seen the dangers of relying on the total funding factor, let's complete our chart. The actual money retained represents net state aid, while the Even Steven pot is comprised of what we call chargeables in state aid. But what are chargeables in real life? The Oklahoma State Aid funding formula uses an equalization model, where locally affluent school districts give some of their state aid to less locally affluent schools. Local affluence is measured by revenues known as chargeables. Local revenues, or chargeables, used to measure local affluence are property taxes, both local and county, school land earnings, oil, gas, and mineral taxes, motor vehicle collections, and the Rural Electric Association Cooperative Tax. To better understand the equalization model, let's return to our story. Local affluence was represented by the different coupons used. Quincy's 50% off coupon led to a $40 chargeable. John's $20 off coupon resulted in a $20 chargeable. And Rex's birthday boy stance led to his having no chargeables. When each friend withdrew $20, you saw the redistribution of local revenues through the equalization funding factor. The story started with $240 from the company, each coworker receiving $80. After equalization, the same $240 remained, but distributed differently. The same is true in state aid. Equalization does not add to the total amount of state aid, it just shifts the aid between school districts. The equalization model worked as intended for many years. However, the last decade has seen a growing imbalance inside the formula. To better understand, we return to the restaurant. First, we must answer a universal question. When three guys share a booth, how do they decide who doubles up? Here's a previously omitted fact. John and Quincy are the eldest sons of Mr. and Mrs. Smith, while Rex is the Jones family only child. Taking this new information to our equalization graph helps highlight the imbalance. While the Smith family contributed $60 to the Even Steven pot, they only received $40 when the pot was redistributed. Conversely, the Jones family contributed nothing to the Even Steven pot, but received $20 upon the redistribution. While the total impact on net state aid remains at zero, there is a clear imbalance between the two families. When examining state aid, the Smith family represents public schools, both contributing and receiving distributions through equalization. Charter schools are represented by the Jones, contributing nothing to chargeables, but taking a full share of their redistribution. In fiscal year 16, public schools contributed $1.609 million of chargeables, while charter schools added nothing. Through the equalization funding factor, public schools received $1.565 million for a net loss of $44 million. This $44 million was given to charter schools. Again, a net state aid impact of $0, but a clear $44 million imbalance. Now that we see how public and charter schools are treated differently in the state aid formula, we must re-examine our funding comparisons. This time, we start with fiscal year 09, when charter schools received $3,275.60 per student, while public schools received $2,005.68 per student. This difference of $1,269.92 was the impact of equalization. In fiscal year 16, charter schools received $3,034.60 per child, while public schools barely received half of that, at $1,560.87. The impact of equalization having grown to $1,473.73. When changes in funding are measured, we see that while charter schools are receiving $241 less per student, public schools are actually receiving $444.81 less. To add perspective, if my district, Putnam City Schools, had received in fiscal year 16 the level of funding we received in fiscal year 9, we would have had $14.3 million more in state aid. An extra $14.3 million means we could have added almost 2 teachers per grade per school. Another option would have been to give every teacher close to a $7,900 raise. Maybe a combination of the two would have been preferred, adding a teacher per grade per school and giving each teacher a $3,300 raise. So, what did the story tell us? First, the total funding factor, the only funding factor seen on a state aid form, is a contrived number that obscures what is really happening in funding of schools. All public dialogue and state laws should reference the true funding factor. Next, the inclusion of charter schools has thrown the state aid formula out of balance. Lastly, the combined impact of the first 2 points has led to a hidden $445 per child decrease in public school funding since fiscal year 9. This presentation is not a statement on charter schools. It is not intended to propose funding changes or support funding solutions. Its only purpose is to illuminate the state aid process so that before solutions to state aid funding debates are proposed, we first thoroughly understand the questions.